What if I told you that on your wedding night, strangers would inspect your body to prove your purity, that you could marry someone you'd never met through a ceremony you weren't even present for, that your husband could legally force himself on you, beat you, and the law would call it his right? Today we think of Victorian marriages as romantic fairy tales, elegant gowns, grand ceremonies, true love conquering all. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Victorian marriage wasn't about love. It was about ownership, control, and systematic abuse disguised as sacred duty. Because what you are about to see will shatter everything you thought you knew about the good old days of marriage. These aren't just disturbing practices. They were nightmares that millions of women lived through. And some of these horrors lasted well into the 20th century. Let's start with something that sounds impossible today. Imagine walking down the aisle to marry no one. In 1743, Princess Louisa of Great Britain stood in the church at Lane Palace in Hanover, speaking her marriage vows to her brother, William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. But William wasn't the groom. He was a proxy, a stand-in for Prince Frederick of Denmark, a man she had never met. The Georgian Papers program reveals the legal document that made this nightmare possible, a formal authorization granting William Augustus the power to conduct matrimonium verum, purum et legitimum, true, pure, and legitimate marriage on behalf of the absent groom. This wasn't rare. This was routine. Marriage by proxy served military needs, political alliances, and family convenience. But imagine the psychological horror. You're dressed in your finest gown, surrounded by your family, speaking the most sacred words of your life to your brother, to a friend, to anyone except the man who will control every aspect of your existence from this moment forward. For Princess Louisa, this phantom wedding was just the beginning. She would travel for weeks to reach Denmark, where she would meet her actual husband for the first time at a second ceremony. If she was lucky, he might be kind. If she was unlucky, well, she was already legally bound to find out. But proxy marriages served a darker purpose than convenience. They were traps. Once the vows were spoken, even to a stand-in, there was no escape. No backing out, no changing your mind when you finally met the man who now owned you. The bride had become property before she ever laid eyes on her purchaser. But if you thought the ceremony was disturbing, wait until you hear about the wedding night, the most intimate moment of a woman's life, witnessed by strangers. In Victorian England, a bride's virginity wasn't just expected, it had to be proven. And that proof came in the most humiliating way imaginable: the public inspection of bloodied sheets. Historical records revealed that wedding night examinations were conducted not just by husbands, but by family members, servants, and sometimes medical professionals. The hymen became a battleground, its presence or absence determining a woman's worth, her family's honor, and sometimes her very survival. Dr. William Acton, writing in his 1857 medical guide, documented the establishment's obsession with female purity. Women were examined throughout their marriages, their bodies treated as property requiring regular inspection for moral cleanliness. But here's what makes this even more sinister. The proof could be faked. Medieval texts reveal that clever brides would hide vials of chicken blood in their jewelry, spilling it onto the sheets under cover of darkness. The fact that women felt compelled to deceive their new husbands on their wedding night tells us everything about the terror they faced. One historical account describes a bride who screamed blue murder during her wedding night examination, but not a sound was heard due to the thick walls and heavy curtains designed specifically to muffle such cries. The room was described as a chamber where you can be perfectly secure in your violence. The inspection wasn't just about virginity, it was about establishing dominance. From the moment those sheets were examined, a woman learned that her body was not her own. It belonged to her husband, to his family, to society itself. She was a vessel to be inspected, approved, and used. Victorian medical texts describe these examinations with clinical detachment, as if violating a woman's most private parts was as routine as checking her pulse. The vaginal speculum, originally designed for medical necessity, became an instrument of control and humiliation. And if a woman failed these tests, if she couldn't produce the required evidence of purity, she faced social exile, family disgrace, and sometimes violence. The shame wasn't just hers, it belonged to every woman who came after her. The wedding night was just the beginning of a woman's nightmare. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist. The law stated explicitly that the husband and wife are one person in law. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during her marriage, not metaphorically, literally. The instant a woman said, "I do," she vanished from the eyes of the law. She couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't sue or be sued, couldn't even keep her own wages if she worked. Everything she had been, everything she owned, everything she would ever earn, it all belonged to her husband. Marriage settlements from the Georgian era reveal the cold mathematics of human trafficking disguised as romance. One actual contract reads, 6 bullocks for a bride. The woman's value was literally calculated in livestock. The National Women's History Museum documents show families negotiating dowries like property sales. If the bride brings £4,000, invested at 5% interest, this adds £200 per year to the family income. Women weren't wives. They were investment portfolios with wombs. When Elizabeth Shaw wrote to her traveling husband in 1816, her letter was appended to business reports and ironmonger accounts. Even her expressions of love were treated as addendums to commercial correspondence, reflecting her legal status as an extension of her husband's business interests. The moment a woman married, she lost the right to her children, her property, her earnings, and even her name. She became what legal scholars called femme couverte, a covered woman hidden beneath her husband's legal shadow. As one legal scholar noted, she had fewer rights than livestock. A man could be imprisoned for 3 months for ill-treating a dog, but only fined £5 for beating his wife. The law literally valued animal welfare above women's lives. The settlement papers reveal the brutal truth. Marriage was a business transaction where women were the commodity being sold. Inside these marriages, women faced a daily horror that had a name. Marital duty, what it really meant. Victorian medical texts declared that wives must submit to their husbands' sexual demands, regardless of their own health, pregnancy, or emotional state. Dr. William Acton's 1857 guide proclaimed that the majority of women are not very much troubled by sexual feelings of any kind. This wasn't observation, it was prescription. Victorian doctors recommended that wives endure sexual relations as a form of medical treatment for their husbands' masculine vigor. Resistance was classified as a mental illness requiring intervention. Women's diaries from the era speak in coded language about the ordeal, the trial, and submitting to duty. One anonymous entry from 1863 reads, "I lay me down upon my bed, a prisoner on the rack, and suffer dumbly as I must, till the kind day comes back." They couldn't write openly about rape because they had no word for what was happening to them within marriage. The law was clear. A husband cannot rape his wife. This wasn't social opinion. It was legal doctrine, enshrined in English common law. Women's letters describe feeling dead inside, like a ghost in my own home, and buried alive in marriage. They developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe trauma: dissociation, depression, and learned helplessness. Church doctrine taught that a wife's body belonged to her husband as part of God's design. Sermons from the period describe marital submission as a woman's path to salvation, her suffering as Christ-like sacrifice. The psychological warfare was systematic. If a woman tried to refuse her husband's rights, he could legally imprison her in their home until she submitted. This wasn't abuse, it was legal marriage. Victorian medical records show that doctors who treated wives injured during forced sexual encounters were instructed to maintain confidentiality, not to protect the victim, but to preserve the husband's reputation. The woman's pain was irrelevant, the man's honor was everything. This legal protection for marital rape persisted until 1991 in England. Women born in the Victorian era lived their entire lives under a system that denied their most basic right to say no. What we've discussed so far was considered normal, but there was something even darker. A husband cannot rape his wife. Actual legal doctrine. This wasn't just social opinion. It was enshrined in English common law and enforced by Victorian courts. The logic was simple and horrifying. Since a woman's body belonged to her husband through marriage, he couldn't steal what was already his property. This law persisted with shocking longevity. In England, marital rape wasn't criminalized until 1991, meaning women born in the Victorian era lived their entire lives under this legal framework. Court records revealed the devastating consequences. Women who sought help from magistrates were told their suffering was a private matter between husband and wife. Police refused to investigate domestic violence that included sexual assault. One case from 1863 involved a woman who appeared before a magistrate with visible injuries from sexual assault. The judge dismissed her case, stating, "What occurs between a man and his wife in the privacy of their bedchamber is not a matter for this court." The press occasionally reported extreme cases, but always with careful euphemisms. A husband who exercised his conjugal rights with excessive vigor might receive a gentle rebuke, but never criminal charges. The psychological impact extended far beyond individual marriages. Entire generations of women grew up knowing that marriage meant surrendering their right to say no. Mothers couldn't warn their daughters because there was no legal framework for understanding what was happening to them as criminal. Historical records show that when wives became pregnant from rape, they were expected to be grateful for fulfilling their maternal destiny. If they miscarried from violence, they were blamed for being too delicate for marriage. The silence was deafening, and it was enforced by every institution: the courts, the medical establishment, and the family itself. Women suffered alone, believing their pain was normal, their trauma was duty, and their violation was love. Even in these controlling marriages, betrayal was everywhere. Men's affairs versus women's hysteria. While wives were imprisoned by marital duty, their husbands roamed freely through London's thriving underworld. The 1887 Lancet Medical Journal estimated over 80,000 prostitutes in London alone, roughly 3% of the population. These weren't hidden establishments, they were an open secret, a parallel world where married men could indulge desires their wives were forbidden to have. The double standard was breathtaking in its cruelty. A wife's single act of adultery could destroy her completely: loss of children, social exile, financial ruin. But a husband's infidelity? Victorian medical texts actually recommended that men seek sexual variety to maintain their masculine vigor. Women's diaries reveal the psychological torture of this arrangement. One wife wrote, "I am expected to welcome him home with a smile, knowing where he has been, knowing what he has done, knowing I am powerless to stop it." The cruelest betrayal wasn't just sexual, it was medical. Husbands regularly brought venereal diseases home to their wives, who had no way to protect themselves. Victorian medical records show countless cases of wives suffering from syphilis and gonorrhea. When wives became ill, they were blamed for their own suffering. The medical establishment suggested that virtuous women somehow attracted disease through their own moral failings, never acknowledging the obvious source of infection. Some women, driven to desperation, turned to suicide or murder. Others simply endured, developing what one doctor described as the 1,000-yard stare of the matrimonially wounded. The betrayal was complete. Society promised them protection through marriage, then systematically destroyed them within it. The emotional abuse was just the surface. Legal right to beat wives. English common law explicitly granted husbands the right to reasonably chastise their wives. The infamous rule of thumb wasn't folklore. It was legal precedent, documented in court cases throughout the Victorian era. Historical court records revealed the systematic nature of this violence. In 1872, a judge told a wife-beater, "You seem to be under the impression that you have a right to beat your wife, but you have no right to do any such thing." The fact that this needed to be stated explicitly shows how deeply embedded the violence was. Victorian society's emphasis on privacy meant that what happened in the home stayed in the home. Neighbors who heard screaming were expected to mind their own business. Family members who suspected abuse were discouraged from interfering in marital matters. When punishment was imposed for wife-beating, it was typically a small fine or a few days in jail, barely a slap on the wrist for what we would now recognize as felony assault. The abuser would return home, often more violent than before. Women developed elaborate strategies for survival. They learned to read their husbands' moods, to anticipate violence, to minimize their own presence. Some kept detailed records of abuse, hoping someday to use them for legal separation. One woman's diary, discovered in 2019, reveals the daily terror. Tuesday, he struck me for burning the toast. Wednesday, he struck me for not burning it enough. Thursday, I said nothing, did nothing, breathed as quietly as possible. He struck me for existing. A few women found ways to resist. They formed secret networks, passing information about which magistrates might show sympathy, which doctors might treat injuries without reporting to husbands, which convents might offer sanctuary. The psychological impact was devastating. Victorian women's writings describe feeling like prisoners in their own homes, ghosts haunting their own lives, and dead women walking. They lived in constant fear, never knowing when the next blow would fall. For women who couldn't escape through death or madness, there was one final way to be discarded. Women blamed for all fertility issues. In Victorian England, a woman's ultimate purpose was childbearing. If she failed to produce children, especially male heirs, she faced the cruelest punishment of all, being declared worthless. Treatments for infertility were actually forms of abuse. Women were subjected to painful procedures, toxic medications, and psychological torment, all based on the assumption that their bodies were defective. Barren women became social pariahs. They were excluded from social gatherings, whispered about in drawing rooms, and treated as cautionary tales. Some were sent away to take the waters at distant spas, a polite form of exile. Men had the legal right to seek annulment, or, in extreme cases, to remarry after declaring their wives spiritually dead due to barrenness. The discarded wife would be left with nothing: no children, no home, no identity. Women's secret sorrow was compounded by the knowledge that their failure might not be their fault at all. But Victorian medicine blamed women for everything, from miscarriages to male infertility. The final cruelty was that many of these women were perfectly capable of bearing children. Their husbands' violence, diseases, or medical ignorance were the real causes of their childlessness, but they carried the shame alone, believing themselves fundamentally broken. After hearing all of this, you might wonder how recently these practices ended. The most shocking truth about these Victorian nightmares: many of them persisted well into the 20th century. Marital rape wasn't criminalized in England until 1991. Coverture laws weren't fully abolished until the 1980s. Some women alive today lived under legal systems that treated them as property. Generational trauma still affects families whose ancestors endured these horrors. The psychological patterns of submission, the fear of speaking out, the normalization of abuse, these echoes still reverberate through our culture. We've come far, but the journey isn't over. Understanding this history helps us recognize how fragile our progress really is, how easily rights can be stripped away, how important it is to remain vigilant. Why understanding this history matters: because those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. The next time someone talks about the good old days of marriage, remember the women who suffered in silence, who endured in darkness, who fought for the freedoms we take for granted today. Their nightmares became our liberation. Their voices, finally heard, light the way forward.